All right. And it's a beautiful morning out here in San Diego, but I probably don't want to hear the lawnmower all day. So, okay, so welcome. Again, I'm really glad to be here and sharing with you. I'm going to discuss the reference governance policies that we have in the IQ server. So just probably you've heard it, but a brief primer. Our IQ server is a highly customizable on-premise solution. It's the policy engine that powers our Lifecycle, our firewall, and our auditor products. It's also the endpoint that's used to communicate with our data services. So all of the results from your scan reports are displayed in the IQ server, and that's where your developers would go to remediate their security issues. So whether you're just discovering that you're using open source for the first time, which does happen, or you've already have a component vetting process embedded in your software pipeline, building that organization's open source governance policies from scratch can be really complex and labor-intensive process, right? And so that's why in IQ Server we have a complete set of reference policies that are going to help get you a head start. So we'll be reviewing these out-of-box policies and learning how to make them better work for your organization. So let's get moving. So a quick introduction. This is a picture of me sitting on the beach out here in San Diego. But I've been in customer success for the last 2 years, and I work out of Southern California. All of our customer success engineers are remote, and so we're distributed to hopefully be in a location that we can better help our customers. In previous jobs, I've worked for small businesses wearing many different hats, from like software design to database administration and management. So one of the more challenging tasks that I had was actually training our sales team on new software tools for that our IT department would deploy. Oftentimes, I would have to take very complex tasks and then break them down into simple ways that even somebody from sales can understand. And this kind of experience kind of prepared me well for the CS role, customer success role, as we navigate our customers through similar challenges, even though they're much more capable students. So building on that capability, we're going to skip the part where I define what open source is and open source governance and the risks that are associated with those open source projects. We're assuming that you know that. There are much better sources out there for these kinds of topics where you can spend more time learning about it. I know both Jerry and Chris Carlucci went over those, and those are great videos that you might want to review at a later date. So other quick recommendations on getting started with open source security. You can check out the NVD, National Vulnerability Database. There's the URL, as well as the OWASP Foundation, where you'll find resources on how to understand security concerns and navigate through those. For OSS licenses, you can check out the Open Source Initiative, which you'll find a number of resources there. I also found a web series on YouTube called the Upstart Workshop by Todd Harris. You could just Google that or follow that link. He does a really good job of explaining open source licenses and then understanding copyleft requirements. Otherwise, you can also check in with Jerry's talk earlier, where he did go through a really good job working through that. So those are some resources to get started. So let's jump into our discussion. So yeah, actually one last quick note on the reference part of our name. While these out-of-box policies are really good and they work well for our customers, most of our customers actually use them for a foundation for their own governance policy. They're really meant to be a reference for you, and you need to determine your own policies for your organization. So, by providing these in the software, we are helping to build a baseline of your risk and give you a guide to creating your own policies. But they really shouldn't be construed as legal advice or guidance, and you should review them fully before implementing them as your de facto organization's governance policies. So For more assistance on actually creating your governance policy, you can check out the Lifecycle policy workshops that Fernando is mentioning, and I'll also make a plug for that at the end of this discussion. So one of the coolest features of our policy engine is the amount of flexibility you have in creating policies, right? And those are dependent upon your organization's, organization group priorities. So for instance, like your security team is going to focus more on security vulnerabilities in the open source that you use, whereas the legal department is going to be much more concerned with the license issues associated with those components. And this is why we group our reference policies into 3 key governance priorities. And these are security vulnerabilities, license issues, and architectural concerns. So each policy name is prefixed with one of these segments, one of these 3 segments, security, license, and architecture. And then each one of those groups is further broken down and ranked by a severity level or threat level. And that's to help you visualize the policy violations, which policy violations have the highest priority, and where your development should actually focus their efforts in your organization. So that's going to be reflected in the report. Since security policies are the most straightforward, we're going to just jump right into those now. Okay, so our security data team uses the CVSS from the NVD. As the model for scoring vulnerabilities. They gather data from various sources, including, and this is a big long list, it's the NVD, website security advisories, email lists, GitHub events for all open source projects, blogs, OSS index, Twitter, and then even from customer reports, right? So you can learn more about that in our documentation. We have a whole section talking about our security team and how they get the security data. It's a pretty fascinating story. So when that team discovers new vulnerabilities, though, they that haven't been published from the NVD, and that happens quite often, they'll actually assign an internal CVE number, CVE ID, and then they'll score those vulnerabilities accordingly. And again, this is using the CVSS score that you see an example here from the NVD site. This allows us to actually create policy events that are based upon those CVSS scores and then report those violations on identified components, right? And so let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's a couple examples. Up at the top here, I have a component. It's Access 1.2, and it has 3 security issues associated with it. The highest security threat on those issues is a CVSS of 5.8. That's probably a good place to start. If this component was scanned in your application, then you would have a policy violation of security medium, right, with a threat level of 7. So that's based upon the policy reference policies that we have. This violation will actually show up on the report as a orange threat. And again, this is wholly customizable by your security team. So it's important because it may not be as critical as other violations as well, right? So we're looking at this next one down here, Common Beans Util, which is version 1.6. This component has a vulnerability score of 7.5. Right, just one security violation, but it's a pretty severe one. And this flags our security high policy with a threat of 9. So this is going to be red. This is going to be in your developer's face. On the security application reports, they're going to see this as a priority. As the security team has dictated that this is what they should work for first, right, and remediate this issue. And again, this is all customizable when they're creating the policy sets in the IQ server. So this is an example here of the actual security high policy that's in the reference set. You can navigate to it by going to the organization policies menu. You can see that the conditions on this policy require that the security vulnerability severity, you'll see that down here in the middle, or CVSS score for the rest of us. That must be greater than or equal to 7, but then also less than 10, right? And this is why a vulnerability score or a CVSS score of 7.5 from the Commons being util will trigger this policy violation. You'll also notice that there's another condition in there. It's actually a mouthful to say. It's security vulnerability status is not applicable, right? So this condition is important because it allows us to actually have a remediation path built into our policies when a violation is not applicable for our application, right? Because of maybe our exposure surface is lower, or work that the development team has actually done to avoid the issue. So let me show you what that looks like next. So this would be the violation from the actual scan report. We can check the vulnerabilities tab of the component information panel, or CIP as we like to call it. You can see here, this is the Commons being util 1.6, and it's violating the CVE 2014-0114. So now we get this come up, but however, our cool devs have read this CVE info, right? They clicked on that info button and read through the work that our security research team has done, and they found a fix, right? They're going to apply a fix to the code. So they're going to comment here that they found that fix, and they're going to switch the status over to not applicable. So that way, the next time this application is scanned, that third policy condition down here is no longer met, right? So the status is not applicable. It is not applicable, right? If that makes sense. So the component will no longer fail this policy. So again, this gives us a way of remediating those issues and working through the list of vulnerabilities. So I will have a couple of notes here. First is that just because the application is no longer vulnerable, it doesn't mean that the vulnerability doesn't exist for this component, right? So that's still there. And that's why it will continue to show up in the securities issues tab that's up here. Right now, we're in the policy violations. It'll keep showing up for the application report. It's just going to no longer flag that policy violation. So that way, the developers, when they're going through the reports, it's not going to waste their time remediating or weeding through violations that are no longer applicable. Also, this may not always be the best way to deal with violations, right? So oftentimes, the actual open source developer will learn about the vulnerability and they'll release their own fix. And hopefully, they'll release the fix before the vulnerability becomes known. So upgrading to that latest version of the component is probably the most effective way to remediate it, and should be the primary path that your developers go through. So here's some more best practices for security. So you'll notice that if you check out the NVD, the latest CVSS version 3 rating now actually includes a critical severity rating that they haven't had previously. Our security reference policy has included this for some time. However, the alignment on the new score is different than our current reference policy. We might change that at some point, but that's kind of how it is right now out of box. So either because of this, or depending on what your own security team, your own governance policy dictates, you might want to adjust these, right, to better meet your organization's security risk tolerance. So you can do the adjusting by going to the security critical policy up here. And in the actual policy itself, you would adjust it from a 10 down to a 9, right? And then that way it would include 9 and above, right? So that's going to include the 9 and 10. You just also want to make sure that you adjust the security high policy next, and bring that from a 10 down to a 9. And then that way you're not getting an overlap in between those two policies. So you'll also notice at the bottom of this list, there's a security unscored policy. And we put that in place to catch the kind of infrequent situations when a reported vulnerability doesn't have a score assigned, right? So I believe that we've actually put in place that so this doesn't really happen anymore. But if you ever do get one, the concern there is that the vulnerability might be bad or it might be worse and without a score, you won't really know. And so if you do get one of these, just let support team know and they'll get it corrected. So let's move on to some license issues. So the reference policy for license builds upon the concepts that we've learned from the security policy, such as threat level and policy conditions, right? But it also is going to add 2 new concepts as well. I believe Jerry actually went over the license threat group a little bit, but we'll do that a little bit more. And we're also going to talk about application categories. So let's start with those license threat groups. Our data team has identified hundreds of licenses found in open source components, right? So lots and lots of them. To simplify the process of creating and managing your policies against those licenses, we leverage the concept of the license threat group, which is grouping those licenses together with similar obligations, right? So these are license obligations that you're concerned with for your organization. So you can create your own custom license threat groups or leverage the ones that we have, whatever is important to you. So the reference policy comes with this list of organization obligations. They're the banned, copyleft, non-standard, weak copyleft, and liberal license. There's also this Sonatype special license. It's a special data quality group for when we're not able to determine what the license is on a component. You really don't need to worry about it much. Again, it's one of those things. If you see it come up, which should be rare, you just contact support and they'll make sure they update that component details as well. So a ton of work actually goes into identifying all those license obligations, right? And there goes the lawnmower. So classifying licenses into license threat groups, right? So I can't actually share those details with you here online because it's a little bit of our secret sauce. However, our legal team, if your legal team or when your legal team is ready to review this work, we do actually have an awesome tool that we can share with you that goes into the details about why licenses were classified into those different groups. You can get that tool by just reaching out to your customer success team, and we'll get it to you. So that's really exciting. So in this example here is the license banned threat group. You can see that these are licenses, again, as Jerry mentioned, that organizations find too restrictive to safely use in the code. So they just outright ban them in the organization across the board. They include things like the AGPL, which requires components to requires that if you use that component, you have to open source your entire application code, which can be pretty crazy. So on the left, you'll see a list, the left of the section. These are available licenses that can be selected and added to the selection group on the right. The reference group are fully customizable. Again, you can move them back and forth. Security team can review it and kind of geek out over it. So it makes the process really easy. Again, we have basic groups that are already existing, but you can create your own threat groups based upon what your needs are. So another license threat group I want to talk about is the copyleft licenses. So these are the licenses that require you to open source your code if you distribute the application, right? So that's the key requirement. So theoretically, if you're using the components for an internal application only, it should be actually safe to use, and you won't have any negative obligations. That's again going to be up to your legal team to determine. The obligations only really kick in when the application is distributed. So in order to use this policy, you would want to scope it to only those applications, right? Only the applications that are going to be distributed. And this is where we're going to leverage that application category. And so only this policy will only apply to those applications that have been labeled with that distributed application. You can see in the inheritance section here when we're selecting it, that this policy will only apply to applications in that category. So for other applications that don't have this policy will just not be used. So again, our reference policy comes with 3 different application categories as a default. These are the distributed, hosted, internal. you can actually leverage the application categories to effectively tailor your policy based upon your own different organizational requirements. It's limited to licenses either. You can actually do this for security and architectural concerns as well. The reference policy set includes these basic ones, but you can adjust them, add new ones, remove them, change the color to make it whatever you want. And then the description helps your devs understand what that category is associated with. When you're actually assigning them to an application, you can assign one or more or none. So you have a lot of flexibility in how that's configured. So one best practice regarding the application categories is to not go crazy creating lots of categories for everything under the sun. While they can be useful for tagging applications with organizational metadata, too many categories may get difficult to manage in the long run. And they won't really provide much value to your teams. So the key thing here is to plan your requirements for policy to something simple and effective as possible, right? We see our customers spend a lot of time doing this, just getting it right. And so that's another point where you can reach out to the customer success team and we'll help guide you, provide guidance on this. So after you've used Lifecycle for a while and modified your license threat groups, or maybe just deleted all the licenses in the license threat group, you might see this policy violation show up in your scans. So this is the threat not assigned. This policy is letting you know that you have a license within your application that has not been assigned to a license threat group yet, right? So basically what that means is that license isn't going to hit any policy violation because it hasn't been determined what policy it's going to violate. So as we expand our language coverage, like our security team is adding more data and more components, we do send out updates about new licenses that get identified. But if you don't update your license threat groups, in case you've customized them, because we don't actually manually or we don't automatically do that for you, because we don't want to ruin the groups that you have configured. So you will have to actually add those licenses to those threat groups. And so, you'll get this violation that would show up. And once you do, you just add the license to the threat group. If you need help with that, again, let us know. So the final license issue that I want to bring up is this license modified weak copyleft. So these are licenses with a copyleft obligation, but they really only kick in if you make a change to that component, right? So changes to the open source, if you make a change, you actually have to send that back to the open source community as a whole. So we use this concept called the similar match condition for these licenses to determine if that component has been changed, and that will also fire the component similar policy. So let's jump into that one next. So the component similar is a policy that's flagged when the component has been modified from the original open source version, right? So since we don't actually see your source code, we don't know what kind of changes happen to this component. We just know that it's different in some way. So it's possibly that change isn't really a big deal, right? Maybe the developer compiled the project themselves on their own, or they downloaded it from some random website as opposed to like Maven Central, or they fixed the bug in it, right? There was a bug and they fixed it in the component, or they decided to add a crypto miner, whatever. So either way, the modified open source component is an actual risk to your organization, and it could involve unneeded tech debt to your application. So as a best practice, you want to use the official components from official repositories as much as possible, so that way you can avoid these risks. If you do decide to continue to use this component, you can assign a waiver to it and add a description of the changes that were made, as well as who to blame for allowing to go through. So we do allow you to track that in your application. So the component similar match is our first architectural concern. So let's jump into the other ones. So this next architectural concern here is this component unknown, which is when we don't recognize enough of the component to be confident in what it actually is, right? So As I mentioned, we don't look at source code. Instead, our scanners do a recursive fingerprinting of the binaries and the components inside the application. These are matched to an extensive catalog of open source components, so that way we can provide you with a bill of materials. The component might be unknown because we don't know what your source code is, or it could be vendor software that you have in your application, or something that's outside of our core supported languages. If you get one of these and you can identify the component directly in the CIP and then claim them, so that way they're accounted for going forward and you know what's in your software. So architectural concerns often take secondary priority to security and legal issues. They're highly varied based upon organizations, language that you use, and then the application categories that you might have, right? So the next two here are in our reference policy set, but they're mainly just for informational purposes. The architectural cleanup policy is an example of flagging text components, which should probably not be in your final application, and they could potentially pose unnecessary risk. So you'll get this when those components exist there. You can actually you see that they're tailored towards Maven, but you set up coordinates for pretty much any other ecosystem as well. So you would just customize that based upon what your need is. The architectural quality policy focuses on additional metadata, such as the components of the additional metadata of the components, such as age and popularity, right? So old components may have newer versions available, and staying on those old components could add a tech debt to your system, right? So and now if there is no new versions available, it could be that the project is dead and it's no longer maintained. So any security vulnerabilities that could have been there are just not being notified and reported, and so that adds its own level of risk. So staying fresh on the latest components is important. So popularity is a concept. Since we're the stewards of Maven Central, we get to monitor download usage of components, and that gives us kind of intelligence onto what's popular and what's not, right? So the idea is if you have a component that's widely unpopular, there might be a reason why the community is not using it. So there could be some unnecessary risks associated with that. And again, your architectural team will decide what the priority is for that. So that's a quick tour of our reference policy sets. A couple of best practices to throw in at the end there is you make sure you document your policy. So whether you're using the reference set or you start making tweaks and changes on your own, the IQ server right now doesn't have a real good way of versioning your policy. That might be something that we do in the future. But for now, make sure you document it. Why did you make the changes that you did to it? And then that way going forward, when somebody's asking questions, they can see that. Or if you hose a policy, you know how to roll back to what is actually important to your organization. So we do highly recommend putting together that document. You can reload the reference policy. This is a dangerous thing to do. So because if you have application scans or you've done some work, reloading the reference policy will actually nerf everything, and that might be bad. So if you do need to do that and you want to just kind of hit the reset button, this link here will take you to our quick start guide where we talk about how you can load in the reference policy set, and it'll give you a JSON file that you can download for that. Enough people have talked about the available workshops. What we talked about here is a little sampling of what we often do in our policy workshop, but that policy workshop is much more extensive. And so we definitely recommend going through that. You'll get a lot of value out of it. You can get a customer success agent to show up and actually help you do the work and understand this in your team. So, and again, feel free to email customer success. We're here to make you successful. And so we love talking to our customers and providing value. So, let us know what you think. So thanks. I think you're muted, Mark.
Yeah, I have 2 mute buttons just to be safe.
Just in case, right?
I think one of the things, if I'm following the patterns properly, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but a lot of people come to us initially because of what you just talked about, that it's a licensing and governance issue that they're looking at, right? And then what that does is it leads into the broader scope of security in the whole pipeline. But this is the entrance point, right?
That's right. Yeah, quite often organizations to us, and they have a very clear governance policy, and they want to move through getting that implemented into the IQ server and leveraging that. The IQ server allows you to automate that policy across your organization. So, there's a lot of power and flexibility there. We also see the other end too, right? Somebody's just starting out with DevOps and they don't actually have clear policies at all. And at that point, they're looking to us for some of that guidance. When we have our policy engagements, quite often we're sitting there explaining this process and then working with them to be able to tweak that reference policy to better meet their needs. So we put that in there because it's a lot of our customers have used that, and we find that it works well. We do tweak it occasionally, based upon changes of ecosystem and such. But the latest version of IQ Server will have it. So, at the same time, it really comes down to what's important to the organization. And the report, just because something has a security vulnerability, it may not necessarily be that applicable to that organization. So the actual policy violations really just puts what's important in front of the developers, and they're not seeing a lot of spam. Because if it's not something that's important to them, they're just going to ignore it. And quite often, that's what happens with other tools.
All right. Thank you so much. Very informative session. Thanks.
Awesome. Glad to be here.
All right. Go hit the beach after you go to the Slack channel
right,
and dump off your slides and then talk to people. Hey, thanks.
Well, early day for me. So cheers. Thanks, Mark.